Peter Dane was brilliant. That was beyond doubt. However, at the end of the day he was still only a rat, and in the shadow of giants there was only so much he could do. So when disaster struck, he fled into a deep haze of midnight rain. Tonight, the worst had come to pass. Tonight, Peter had ignored his instincts, and a dear friend had paid the price. Peter splashed through little rivers, streaming down gutters, dodging under waves cast by the giant machines of great apes. His heart was heavy, but his head light. He felt as if he might drift away into the night. Peter took a chance and began the perilous rush across the street. Headlights flashed about him, refracting through the thick rain and lighting up the world with the fire of earthly suns. Peter froze and ducked low as the machines flashed overhead. The moment there was an opening, he continued on his way. Peter ducked down a dark alley into the shadow of a dumpster. He heard a terrible, rumbling howl, the sound of great apes struggling nearby. Lightning flashed and thunder crashed, lighting up the craggy, mountain-like features in the night, distorted and nightmarish as they stretched and bent in rage and terror. Peter stayed silent as he crawled behind the dumpster, eventually emerging from behind a trash can somewhere much further along. Peering through the void, he caught sight of a large cardboard box, shelter where he had left behind the roller scale, a sailing vehicle fashioned from a great ape's discarded roller skate. Peter gave a shout as he slipped into the box. "Matrix! Monster! Stew!" 3 figures stirred to meet the returning rat. Matrix, a small, quick spider, scuttled to the top of the scale's mast. Monster, a gargantuan, hairless mouse, rolled over and rose to his feet atop the metal deck. And Stew the Shrew poked his nose out from beneath the vehicle. Peter clutched at his hammering heart as he slumped against the wall of his shelter. "They've taken her!" Monster raised a suspicious eyebrow. When he spoke, it was almost an accusation.
"I thought you said you had done this before."
Peter nodded. "Yes, dozens of times, but always alone. I've never even taken Matrix along."
"Who got it, eh?"
Stew growled.
"Who took Elizabeth?"
Peter gulped, taking a heavy breath to settle his nerves. "I didn't recognize him. Then again, great apes all look the same to me." Monster growled.
"What would a great ape want with a mouse?"
"A pet," Stew suggested.
"They have been known to keep mice for pets. Shoot, they even keep rats."
Peter shook his head. "In a laboratory? Unlikely. Besides, Elizabeth is, if you'll pardon the expression, she isn't tame. I doubt she'd take to captivity."
"Then what will they do to her?"
Monster rumbled. The way he seized up his halberd, that mighty polearm that no other mouse could lift, carried the implication of impending violence. Peter let out a shaking breath. "More than likely she'll be a test subject."
"A test subject?"
Monster repeated. Peter shrugged helplessly. "Or they may feed her to a snake, or some other more primitive predator." Stew practically leapt in panic as he shouted furiously.
"Well then, we gotta save her!"
Peter buried his face in his hands. "It may already be too late. I haven't been there for years. I don't know what the great apes could be up to." Peter felt the light tapping of needle-like limbs up the arm of his tweed jacket, and as he opened his eyes, he saw the fuzzy, 8-eyed face of Matrix looking back at him. The spider's expression was alien and unreadable, but by the way he patted Peter's head, the rat could only guess Matrix was trying to comfort him.
"Where is this lab?"
Monster grumbled. Peter could only whisper his answer as his head swam at the prospect of a return. "I can take you there. Under the cover of the night and the rain, we'll be able to reach the outer wall. From there, Matrix can climb to the roof and toss down a rope."
"And then?"
Stew asked eagerly. "Then we haul up the scale after us. We'll need it for a quick, safe getaway." A spark of suspicion flashed in Monster's eye.
"And how do we get in?"
Peter locked eyes with the savage mouse, a flash of his own gleaming in his eye, this one of determination. "Leave that to me." Elizabeth Hartley had not been an easy catch. The small, attractive woman, by mouse standards, had recently begun sparring with Monster. As such, she had grown accustomed to defending herself against larger adversaries. But there was a limit to what she could do, and the colossal great apes easily exceeded that limit. She was disarmed, stripped bare, and locked in a small cage consisting of a metal frame and wire mesh walls. As a great ape carried her away to who knew what fate, the cage bounced about with his immense strides. Elizabeth was jostled about one moment, and then leapt about the next, hurling herself against the walls of her moving prison, and grinding her teeth away as she chewed in vain at the mesh. She shrieked relentlessly as she fought the metal walls and floor. The great ape didn't appear to notice. Towering corridors passed by, passages, openings, built on an unthinkable scale. Elizabeth might have been tempted to call it cosmic, for she felt as though she were passing through the emptiness of outer space. Great leathery soles flapped against the hard white floors. The walls, the ceiling, the ground itself were composed of a strange alien material beyond Elizabeth's experience. For a time, the cage was set down on a broad, flat plain, so flat it could not have been natural. To the side, the ground abruptly fell away into a vast, empty chasm. Elizabeth considered attempting to knock her cage over the side, yet as she looked down, she could not see the bottom. Fall, she realized, could easily have been suicide. For a moment, she heard the low rumblings of the great ape. He sat before a giant tan box, and as near as Elizabeth could figure, appeared to be talking to it. A moment later, he was answered with a deep electric crackle. Then the great ape stood up, grabbed the cage, and they were off again. A mountainous door flew open, like an entire cliffside falling away. Then Elizabeth sailed through, and another chamber opened up before her. She saw giant countertops, gargantuan desks, and in a rapidly approaching corner, a large cube-shaped enclosure. The great ape held the cage out. A pair of perpendicular fences divided the enclosure into 4 comparably sized courtyards. There were 3 ramps, one leading over each of 3 fences, connecting the 4 quadrants in a general U shape. Elizabeth could make out a hard, smooth ground, covered in what looked to be wood shavings, feathers, and other bits of fluff. It reminded her of the sort of materials that mice in her old village used when the nesting seasons rolled around. Elizabeth could also see forms moving around, other mice, but like none she had ever seen before. They were all snowy white, as if all the color had been drained from their fur. Some were unthinkably thin and sickly. Others were fat, misshapen, and barely mobile. And then there were the lean, strong ones that twitched and fidgeted, glancing this way and that, and snarling at anything that drew too close. The great ape set Elizabeth's cage down in the lower left quadrant and flipped one end open. Elizabeth didn't move. She peered through the wire mesh at her surroundings. There appeared to be only men in that quadrant. And what men! They appeared healthy, strong, and reasonably muscled, yet they held their heads low, eyes peering up and around. The air was tense. As each man passed her, he extended his head towards the cage and took a whiff of the new arrival. He would lick his lips and bare his teeth, an eager look flashing across his face. Elizabeth gulped. There was something deeply wrong with the manner of each man who approached. It was something in the way they moved, something not quite right in their eyes. They looked as if all capacity for reason had been stripped away, leaving them wild shells of what a man should be. The great ape, growing impatient, tilted the cage forward and gave it a shake. With a terrified yelp, Elizabeth tumbled onto the ground. All around her, ears perked up, and maddened, hollow eyes turned her way. As whiskers twitched and snouts wrinkled into snarls, Elizabeth felt more like she was surrounded by a group of tarantulas than her own kind. Elizabeth backed towards the nearest fence and quickly regretted it. There was a sudden zap, which sent her hopping forward with a yelp. Behind her, the fence hummed and surged with energy. All around her, the strange, twisted men crawled out of the woodwork. Some emerged from under the cover of the materials littering the ground. Others emerged from holes in the side of a box in the far corner, suspended above a spiral stairway. Others simply rose to their feet from where they had been laying half asleep just a moment before. Elizabeth took a deep breath, eyeing each of the approaching men in turn. Some snarled at the smaller or weaker individuals and nipped at their ears and tails. The displays of aggression sent the lesser men scurrying away. The stronger, more aggressive specimens, however, would fight back, and isolated brawls would break out among the gathering crowd. Elizabeth forced an uneasy smile. The chances were good that she would have to fight, but she preferred to try talking her way to safety first. She waved in what she hoped would be a friendly gesture to those men who were still approaching.
Hello.
Without exception, the mice hopped back a step, flinching at the motions of Elizabeth's hand, and then flattening their ears against the backs of their skulls when they heard her speak. They did not appear to understand the gesture, nor did they recognize the meaning of Elizabeth's false smile. In the brief lull, Elizabeth began inching towards the nearest ramp, her best hope for an escape into the neighboring quadrant, away from these feral mice. Noting their apparent fear of her voice, she continued talking, in gentle tones perhaps, but still loud enough that a tone of strength rang through.
Don't worry about me. I'm going now. I'll just leave you to whatever it is you were doing. Goodbye.
The nearest mouse lunged for Elizabeth and crashed into the fence with a loud electric sizzle as she darted out of his way. Like water bursting through a dam, every mouse in the quadrant charged. They crashed, jostled, and stumbled as they rushed for the first woman to drop among them in their collective memories. Elizabeth, for her part, was considerably more agile than her pursuers. She hopped and slid over the back of a mouse as he dove for her, and then skidded under the shadow of one that tried to catch her in another leap. As Elizabeth weaved and dodged, a crowd began to gather on the other side of the fence. There arose shouts and cheers as a new group of mice watched. It was, quite simply, the most excitement they'd had in a long time, not unlike watching a football game or an action movie. Elizabeth received a momentary reprieve as she ducked low, leaving two crazed mice to crash headlong into each other. A third stumbled over them, adding to the heap, and forcing the remaining pursuers to rush around their sides. They were only slowed a split second, but to Elizabeth that may as well have been an eternity. Her lead grew. Moments later, she reached a ramp. A solitary mouse stood at the top. He was scarred from many battles, and looked on with a cold, savage eye. But as Elizabeth darted up towards him, the mouse stepped aside, allowing her to pass, and then stepped forward to contend with the oncoming madmen. A round of cheers went up as Elizabeth descended the ramp, and a crowd of mice, both men and women, rushed up to meet her. Unlike the prior group, however, these ones appeared at least somewhat civilized. "Incredible!" one shouted. "What agility! What grace! What beauty!"
Thank you?
Elizabeth exclaimed as she struggled to keep up with all the hands reaching out to shake hers. "You smell strange," a woman observed, sniffing at the back of Elizabeth's neck. "Of course she smells strange," a man answered the woman. "Note the color of her fur. She's foreign." "That's enough," a voice roared from higher up. The mouse that had guarded the ramp descended in a blustering fury. "You can all get to know her later. For now, give us some space." Elizabeth sighed with relief as the crowd reluctantly dispersed. However, she wasn't so fond of the way the mouse said us rather than her. Perhaps she was overthinking things. Perhaps she had simply grown paranoid. But she didn't like the way that mouse was looking at her, and she especially didn't like the way he was now approaching her. "Come with me," the mouse ordered. Elizabeth paused, noting the expressions of the other mice as they withdrew. Sour looks, discreetly directed towards the man who, at this moment, appeared to be in charge. Was that an edge of fear she saw? "Now!" Elizabeth looked the mouse up and down, noting his posture and expression. He was getting impatient, and if Elizabeth didn't know better, she might have guessed he was on the verge of a temper tantrum. Elizabeth folded her hands in front of her waist, looked towards the ground to avoid eye contact, and asked the most innocuous question she could think of.
Where are we going?
That only appeared to anger the other mouse further. He took a step forward and grabbed Elizabeth roughly by the arm.
To the nesting chamber. Come!
Despite his bulk and strength, however, the mouse's grip was strangely weak. Elizabeth easily slipped out of his hold.
I'd rather not, thank you.
I am Alpha. You will do as I say.
Elizabeth's cheeks stung horribly, and the world spun as the man lashed out with barely a warning and struck her backhanded across the cheek. His grip may not have been very strong, but his strike was. Elizabeth toppled onto her side with a surprised yelp.
On your feet. Come!
Elizabeth rubbed her aching jaw and shook the stars from her vision. As she looked up at the man, the fingers of her free hand curled into a fist, gathering up bits of hair and wood shavings. As Elizabeth's legs coiled like springs beneath her, she shook her head. Then she glared into his eyes, as cold and harsh as a glacier's heart, and answered,
No, I don't think I will.
Alpha was still for a moment. Elizabeth could almost see his mind spinning behind his eyes as he struggled to make sense of the situation. Then he shouted in anger and rushed for Elizabeth, only to be met with her fistful of fluff. It flashed up before his eyes and opened, scattering its contents into the Alpha's vision. He staggered with a yell, blinking furiously. Elizabeth took advantage of Alpha's moment of vulnerability. She darted to his side and leapt across his back, catching his throat in the crook of her arm as she passed, and then jammed her knee into the small of his back. She heaved back on Alpha's neck as she landed, dragging him off balance, so that struggle as he might, his feet were light on the ground, and every motion was weakened. In time, his struggles slowed. When Elizabeth finally released him, he tumbled unconscious to the ground. Elizabeth ran a hand through her hair and heaved a sigh of relief. That relief, however, was short-lived, for no sooner did the Alpha hit the ground than there arose a joyous cheer all around her. Though no crowd gathered, when Elizabeth looked up, she did see 3 more mice approaching her. Men, all 3. Elizabeth gulped and immediately began glancing about as she planned another course of escape. The largest of the 3 mice, however, simply applauded. His 2 companions broke out clapping shortly after him. Then he stopped and motioned for the other 2 to do the same. They quickly obeyed.
Nice moves, Alpha baby, he greeted.
Elizabeth blinked.
Alpha? I just left him back there. Or is that a title?
You beat the old Alpha, sweet cheeks. That makes you the new Alpha.
Uh-huh.
Elizabeth muttered.
I see. In that case, I'll just...
Elizabeth paused a moment as she inched around the 3 mice.
Rest, Alpha,
the first mouse suggested.
That's a big leap.
Yeah, big leap, the second mouse agreed.
Big responsibility,
the third grumbled. Elizabeth cautiously glanced over either shoulder, but all she saw were mice crouched low, backing away from her.
And what exactly does the Alpha do?
Mostly he beats up the rest of us,
the third mouse answered. He guards the ramp, the second mouse added.
He gets all the ladies, the first mouse finished. Of course, this is the first time we've had a female Alpha. This should be interesting.
As one body, all 3 mice took a step forward. Elizabeth answered with a step back, and quickly scooped up another fistful of the fluff covering the floor.
I'm not interested.
The 3 mice glanced curiously at one another.
Not interested,
the first repeated. She's not interested, the second exclaimed. The third looked his companions up and down and shrugged.
Nope.
I don't suppose there's a place I could rest without being bothered,
Elizabeth asked irritably.
Any place, babe, the first mouse answered. No one bothers a surly Alpha. Except the next Alpha, the third mouse added.
Uh-huh.
Elizabeth muttered. She then struck up an aggressive pose, fists resting on her hips, and gave the 3 mice her iciest glare.
Well, I am feeling very surly.
Now it was the other 3 mice who took a step back. Several steps, to be honest. Elizabeth held her gaze for a bit longer, and then she stalked away for a sheltered corner where she could keep an eye on the rest of the quadrant. As she left them, the three mice heaved a collective sigh of relief.
Man, there goes the young generation. No respect for old utopian values,
the first mouse lamented. Yeah, the second mouse agreed. What a weirdo! The third mouse just shrugged.
The old alpha never turned us down.
As you can see, the situation was not nearly as grim as Peter had thought. Elizabeth was certainly in danger and in need of rescue, but for now she was holding her own. That left the metaphorical ball in Peter's metaphorical court, where just now he was metaphorically winding up for a powerful metaphorical backhand. There was a loud clatter of metal as a large rectangular grate crashed open, a latch near the top having been pried open by an especially resourceful rat.
Finally, Stu grumbled. Now we can get out of this blasted rain.
Yet as the shrew eagerly made for the yawning opening, a large hand reached down from overhead and seized him up by the scruff of his neck. Not yet, Peter cautioned.
Oh, really?
These vents are perilous places, Peter explained. A rat can make his way safely enough, but mice, light as they are, will be blown about by the powerful winds inside.
Yeah, well, I ain't no mouse,
Monster grunted.
But you are smaller and lighter than a mouse.
Which is why we'll be tying ourselves together, Peter concluded, rather like the great apes do when climbing steep cliffs. If one of us is blown away, the others may still catch him. Monster nudged Stu in the side.
That means you, shrew.
Stu, still dangling from Peter's grip, set his hands on his hips and glared down at Monster.
Hey, dummy, I don't know if y'all noticed, but you ain't exactly a rat yourself.
Peter clambered down the side of the air intake and set Stu down beside him. That may be true. However, I suspect his weapon will be heavy enough to weigh him down. Stu gaped at Peter in disgust.
What? That ain't fair.
Life isn't fair,
Monster growled. The look of satisfaction on his face, however, suggested that he was immensely pleased with the situation. Peter ignored his bickering companions, instead focusing on retrieving the silk rope they had used to climb the side of the building, and then haul up the scale after them. As planned, the rope was fastened around each of their waists except for one.
Hey,
Stu protested.
How come Spidey ain't tying himself down?
Matrix won't be climbing with us, Peter explained. He'll be holding on to my shoulders. I expect he has a tight enough grip to stay with me until we find a place to rest.
Uh-huh,
Matrix affirmed with an eager nod. Peter led the way, the first of the three to step over the threshold into that cavernous, yawning metal tunnel. The air was curiously still. The air system doesn't appear to be running just now, Peter remarked. Nevertheless, I strongly urge all of you to proceed with caution. It could start up at any moment. A short time later, the duct split off into three directions, left, right, and straight down. Peter motioned for the others to stay back as he peered over the edge. I remember this place, Peter announced. There should be an opening just a bit further down the shaft. From there, we should be able to reach... Peter abruptly fell silent. His mind drifted back, years back, to a time when he was not so wise and far less intelligent. A time before Matrix, before the Big Cheese, before...
Should be able to reach what?
Stu barked irritably. A place. Out of the wind, Peter answered hesitantly. Peering further down, he added, Yes, there it is. I see it. We'll all have to jump together to reach it, though. Monster looked down at Stu, sizing him up, and grunted.
What?
Stu barked. Monster gave no answer, but instead seized up the surprised shrew and tucked him under one arm.
Say the word, and I'll jump.
Peter took a deep breath and backed away from the ledge. He looked to Monster and nodded.
Wait,
Stu stammered, but the others ignored him. As one body, Peter and Monster charged for the metal ledge and leapt into the abyss. Down, down they fell, Stu shrieking his terrified protest all the way, until Peter spotted the promised opening. "Here!" he shouted. The rope snapped taut as Peter grabbed onto the ledge. Monster, who had not known what he was watching for, missed the edge entirely, and now dangled from around Peter's waist. Stu, at least, finally stopped screaming.
"Wow, Pete, and here I thought y'all was supposed to be smart."
Monster let the shrew drop to free up his hands, and to give the little fellow another good scare. Smirking with a trace of satisfaction at Stu's renewed screams of terror, at least until the rope ran out and the shrew stopped falling again, Monster took the rope in his free hand and, bracing his feet against the side of the shaft, began climbing up to where Peter hung. The rat's fingers were just about to give out when the head of Monster's halberd hooked over the side of the ledge. A moment later, Monster crawled over the side and pulled his compatriots after him. Matrix let out a squeak of relief. Phew! Stu, however, was still frozen with fright, his eyes bulging, unblinking from his skull. At long last, his lips loosened enough to mumble,
"Let's not do that again, eh?"
"This way, lads," Peter shouted. "We're almost there." Peter led off down the new duct, Monster hot on his heels as he dragged the still frozen but now twitching Stu behind him. "It should be somewhere along here," Peter explained. "We, that is I, chose it for its central location. We should be able to safely reach most of the lab from there." Monster's brow furrowed as he listened.
"You sound evasive."
Peter ignored Monster's remark, instead rubbing his fingers against the side of the duct as he went. "It's well hidden, easy to miss, even if you know what to look for. And it's out of the way, the perfect hideaway for an escaped lab rat."
"What aren't you telling us?"
Peter stopped as he noticed the faintest of cracks in the duct. "This is it!" Monster raised a suspicious eyebrow, but said little more while he waited. Peter, meanwhile, dug his fingers into the crack and with a monumental heave of his arms pried open an entire length of wall, revealing a hidden space beyond. "After you, lads." Stu scurried past Monster, eager to get out of the danger zone. The large mouse, however, took it more slowly. His gaze lingered on Peter for a time as the rat followed him in, pulling the entryway closed behind them. Yet the space was still eerily bright, lit up with a low hum by a gigantic monitor. The room, if one could have called it that, was nearly pitch black beyond the small glowing circle radiating from the screen. Wires ran back and forth across the floor, connecting various pieces of tech quite beyond Monster's understanding. At the center of the chamber there stood a solitary rat-sized table. Various little implements lay across it. Scalpels, screwdrivers, wire cutters, just the right size for a sufficiently creative rodent. In the shadows there loomed the forms of metal frames and structures, from which hung chains, wires, bits of rope, and other connecting mechanisms. Monster's brow furrowed as he spotted dark, rust-colored stains running along the table's surface.
"What is this place?"
"This is, or it was rather, my first workshop," Peter explained. "I started tinkering about in here not long after I escaped from the lab." Monster grunted.
"Then I take it you haven't been here recently."
Peter shook his head. "Not for a very long time, no." Monster ventured towards the table and ran his thumb along it.
"Well, someone has. There's no dust."
"Not only that," Stu added, pointing to the monitor.
"Looky up there!"
All eyes turned to the giant screen. Peter gulped uneasily as he laid eyes on it. Monster raised an eyebrow as he glanced back and forth between the rat and the image. "I remember that place," Peter whispered. Stu grinned sheepishly.
"It's the fairground where I went looking for buried treasure."
Monster nodded.
"I remember."
"It's the last thing Arnold saw before it was destroyed," Peter finished. Noting the confused expressions on Monster's and Stu's faces, he added, "That's short for auto-ranging, non-organic light droid." Caught in the picture were the terrified, fleeing forms of the Ferret brothers, Yip and Yap, Peter as he crouched near the ground to avoid bolts of electricity fired from Arnold's shotgun, and, of course, Elizabeth Hartley.
"Peter Dane,"
Monster growled.
This clearly means something to you. What?
It means we can't afford to linger, Peter answered with a shudder. The rat who sent Arnold after me has likely been here recently, possibly using this as a base of operations. And since that picture is several months old, it would appear he's been rather obsessive. Monster raised an eyebrow.
Really? And who would that be?
Peter closed his eyes, shoulders shaking as he realized he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. His name is, or rather it was when I knew him,
Romulus!
Peter yelped in surprise and whirled about. A bright ray of light stabbed through the darkness, emanating from an opening at the far side of the chamber. In the blinding flash, there stood the towering silhouette of an especially tall rat, easily a head taller than Peter. "Everyone back," he whispered.
Come now, Romulus. I won't bite.
The newcomer took a step forward, the light of the monitor falling across his face. Peter's heart nearly stopped, his head growing so light he feared it might float away. At long last, in a low, trembling voice, he asked, "Do I know you?" The other rat smiled and shook his head.
No, I don't believe you do, but I know you. Romulus,
Monster growled.
I think you have some explaining to do.
That would make two of us, the other rat agreed.
Shall I begin?
Peter nodded. I would greatly appreciate that, yes.
I've read a great deal about you. Dr. Valencia kept extensive notes and files on you. And of course, those journals you keep dropping off don't hurt.
The rat's smile weakened a little, and a touch of warmth crept into his eyes.
It almost makes up for all the years we were apart. Years?
Monster raised a curious eyebrow. The typical rat, as you may know, has a far shorter lifespan than the typical human. 1 year to us may seem like several years to one of them.
You say that like you've been apart for more than a lifetime.
The rat nodded with a light chuckle.
From your perspective, I suppose we have.
That still doesn't explain who you are, Peter interjected. The rat turned his attention back to Peter.
Have you looked in a mirror lately, Romulus? Or perhaps you prefer Peter?
Stu glanced between the two rats.
You know, y'all do look a mite similar.
Peter gulped as he whispered the name he had come to dread the most. Remus? The rat shook his head.
Not quite. The name is Jupiter, but you, Romulus, can simply call me Dad.
Dad? Peter repeated, very much taken aback. Dad as in father?
In more ways than one,
the rat Jupiter nodded.
Your mother was my mate, and the very formula that blessed you with your brilliance and your long life is the result of years of testing, which began with me.
Stu blinked.
Y'all mean?
Yes, Jupiter answered. Just as Peter is my son, so too are the chemicals running in his veins the descendants of those that run in mine.
Peter took a step back, blinking and rubbing his forehead, momentarily speechless. Monster, however, couldn't contain himself.
So then, Father, I assume you're the one who appropriated this workshop.
Jupiter frowned, his expression one of both confusion and disappointment.
I was just about to ask Romulus the same thing, actually. I've never seen this place before.
Does that mean we got us another super smart rat running around?
Stu asked. Peter rubbed his forehead and groaned with displeasure. Oh, I desperately hope not.
I don't understand.
Jupiter raised an eyebrow. He appeared genuinely curious.
Is there a reason you want to be alone?
I'll explain later, Peter answered. I actually never planned on coming here, but we're in the midst of something of a crisis. A friend of ours was caught when I made my delivery tonight.
I see,
Jupiter mused. After a moment's thought, however, his expression visibly brightened.
Well, come with me, then. I believe I may be able to help.
Monster grunted.
Help, you say? Of course. I'm quite familiar with these ducts, and I have a rather safe, cozy little home you could stay in while we search for your friend.
Peter glanced towards Monster and then Stu. He saw his own unspoken misgivings reflected in their eyes. Then Matrix appeared, clambering across Peter's chest, and nodded to him. That appeared to break the silence. Stu and finally Monster both nodded their agreement. Looking back to Jupiter, Peter announced, "We would welcome whatever help you can offer." Jupiter shook his son's hand, a broad grin spreading across his face.
"Then come with me."
So it was that Peter met what appeared to be a friend on the inside. Whether he truly was, of course, had yet to be seen. As of that very moment, Elizabeth found herself in a similar situation. Having settled down in a remote corner of the enclosure, with towering white walls securing her on two sides, Elizabeth began to feel an illusion of safety. Her heart grew calm and her mind still, and she was able to more carefully observe her surroundings. At times, she even managed to close her eyes for a few precious moments, only to suddenly open them at the slightest sound. At the other side of her quarter of the enclosure, Elizabeth spotted several of the strange feral mice that first pursued her nosing about the fence. A few ventured up to the ramp, peering over to her side, only to quickly retreat a few moments later. Elizabeth's nose twitched. She could tell something was afoot.
"Do I have to?"
a small voice whined, just a bit to Elizabeth's left. She glanced away from the ramp and saw three familiar forms approaching. It was the second of them that had spoken.
"Someone's gotta do it, man," the first insisted.
"Well, why me?"
"'Cause I can't do it," the first answered. "I've gotta, save face."
"And I'd rather go to sleep,"
the third answered. Elizabeth raised a suspicious eyebrow as the three mice came to a stop in front of her.
Yes?
Elizabeth inched her way along the wall furthest from them, preparing to run. The second mouse glanced back at his two companions, both of whom simply gestured for him to turn around. He shook like a leaf as he finally faced Elizabeth, eyes bulging. At long last he burst out with a wail.
Please forgive our presumption, Alpha. Don't hurt us. We're just stupid servants that don't know any better."
The third mouse grimaced at the first.
"Drama King?"
"Cool it, brother,"
the first mouse muttered, nudging the second in the side.
"Remember what I told you. Play it like ice. Real cool. Alphas like cool. Weakness turns them off."
Right.
Elizabeth eyed the first mouse. Glancing to the second mouse, she added,
Well, okay. You're forgiven. Is that all?
The first mouse grinned back to the third.
"Isn't she something? Just like that and she forgives us."
The third nodded.
"Best alpha ever."
With that, the first mouse grabbed the second, who was still wailing inconsolably, and dragged him aside.
"We were never, introduced right."
He bowed with a flourish before Elizabeth.
"The boys call me Father Son. Waterworks here is Brother Rainbow."
On another day, in another place, Elizabeth might have managed a chuckle. Without Monster watching her back, however, Elizabeth's sense of humor was quite lost.
I see.
Glancing to the third mouse, she asked,
And what do they call you?
"Frank."
Elizabeth gave an uneasy chuckle.
Well, I'm pleased to make your acquaintances. Goodbye.
With that, she slunk away. Father Son, however, crept after her, with Brother Rainbow and Frank at his heels.
"My beautiful Alpha, don't run out on us already."
"We can help you."
Brother Rainbow jumped in. Elizabeth glanced over her shoulder, pursing her lips.
Really? Something tells me you're trying to help yourselves.
"The two go hand in hand dealing with alphas,"
Frank mumbled.
"We just want to please you,"
Brother Rainbow added.
Please, please, please let us please you,"
Father Son agreed. At last, Elizabeth stopped and whirled about to face the three mice.
You want to please me, do you?
Three grinning heads nodded in unison.
Fine, then. What is this place? And how do I get out?
The three mice looked at each other.
"Get out?
"Why would you want to get out?"
Brother Rainbow exclaimed.
This place is like paradise."
"Utopia."
Rent-free buffet, Frank grumbled. Elizabeth was far from convinced, and it showed in her eyes.
Paradise,
More like Utopia, father-son clarified.
Yeah, Utopia.
The Alpha keeps us safe, and we stuff our faces and sleep, Frank finished. Father-son irritably nudged him in the side. We don't worry about material things around here. The doctors provide it all.
That leaves us free to ponder the deep things.
Frank grunted. You guys do the pondering. I get enough sleep for the three of us. Elizabeth eyed the three mice for a long time as it all sank in.
It's kind of a small paradise. Don't you get bored of the same patch of ground, day in and day out?
Father-son shook his head. Nah, we have the mysteries of the universe to occupy ourselves. Deep questions, intellectual pursuits, philosophy and ethics to reason and debate.
Yeah, Brother Rainbow agreed. Like, is it pronounced Dragon or Dragon?
I say Dragon, Frank croaked. Elizabeth blinked.
And this is deep?
Nah, this is intellectual, father-son answered. Deep is the fabric of reality. Am I feeling what's really under my feet, or is the information just being fed into my nerves?
Do we even have nerves? Brother Rainbow chimed in. Or is it all just an illusion?
Of course we have nerves. How else would the information get fed into our minds?
Through our brains?
Our brains are nerves, man. Big, scrunched up bundles of super nerves. Guys, Frank nudged father-son in the side. I think we lost our Alpha.
Indeed they had. While Father-son and Brother Rainbow were busy arguing over the nature of existence, something caught Elizabeth's eye that was considerably more interesting. A tiny figure had clambered up the fence with no ramp, and approached a large black object. Overcome with curiosity, Elizabeth approached the fence. As with the other, it hummed with electricity. Taking a step back, Elizabeth looked up once more. It was indeed a mouse she had seen, but a smaller fellow than she had ever seen before. From a distance, she mistook him for a child. Elizabeth could only guess that he must have been a runt. More curious still was that black rectangular object mounted on the side of the wall. It whirred and hummed with mechanical movements within the exterior shell, and a circular tube protruded from the front, tipped in a glass lens that Elizabeth could only have compared to an eye. Elizabeth sat back on her haunches for a time, watching and listening. The little mouse appeared to be talking to the object as he poked his nose up close to the lens, but Elizabeth couldn't quite make out what he was saying. "Little Mr. Nelson catch your eye, babe?" Elizabeth jumped in surprise at the sound of Father-son's voice.
Yes, Mr. Nelson?
He talks to the doctor's eye, Father-son explained. We're all still waiting for it to talk back.
"Humph," came a loud scoff from atop the fence.
At least I can come and go. Unlike some people here, I'm free.
We're all free, man, Father-son retorted. The body is captive, but no cage can hold the spirit.
Mr. Nelson wrinkled his nose irritably.
Yeah, well, my body's not captive. Not for long, anyway. A word to the camera, and he'll come and get me out.
Who will?
Elizabeth asked.
Oh, mind your own business, lady.
Don't mind Mr. Nelson, Father-son offered. He got it in his head he can mouth off to the alphas.
Elizabeth, however, ignored Father-son. Little Mr. Nelson had turned his attention back to the black object. The camera, he had called it, and was whispering furiously to it. Then he pointed down, in Elizabeth's general direction.
What about me?
Elizabeth called up to the tiny mouse. Mr. Nelson grinned savagely back at Elizabeth and gave a vicious chuckle. You'll see! With that, Mr. Nelson leapt down the other side of the fence and scurried away towards a spiral stairway in the far corner, which led up into a large, cube-shaped chamber. Elizabeth shot Father Son a quizzical look.
Do you have any idea what that was all about?
Father Son shrugged. The boys have a theory about that. He then whistled for his compatriots. Hey, boys, the Alpha wants you.
I don't, actually.
Elizabeth began to say, but it was too late. The other two mice had already arrived.
Are we meeting now? Huh? Are we?
Brother Rainbow jabbered.
Always wondered what females were like,
Frank mumbled. Elizabeth furrowed her brow.
No, we are not mating.
The two mice's faces immediately fell.
Our Alpha just saw Mr. Nelson talking to the Eye, Father Son explained. She wants to know what you boys think about it.
What? You mean that he's got the doctor's ears?
Frank rolled his eyes and shook his head. Brother Rainbow glared sharply at him.
Well, how else is he supposed to come and go unless the doctors take him away and bring him back?
I say he's talking to Demon,
Frank interjected. Brother Rainbow shuddered.
Well, how's he supposed to do that if he's talking to the doctor's eye, huh? There's a reason they don't call it the demon's eye.
Frank shrugged.
I don't know, but the camera always shuts off just after Mr. Nelson talks to it, and then Demon shows up.
Who's this demon?
Elizabeth asked. The three mice exchanged uneasy glances, and then forced three broad grins back at Elizabeth.
Nobody.
Brother Rainbow was the first to speak.
We don't like to talk about him, Frank clarified. Even the Alphas hide when he comes by,
Father Son concluded. Elizabeth scanned the other three quadrants, searching for any mice out of the ordinary. All she saw, though, were more snowy white men and women.
Where is he, then?
Not here,
Frank answered.
I'd thank God for that, if he existed,
Brother Rainbow shuddered.
Then he comes and goes?
Elizabeth guessed.
How does he get in, then?
Elizabeth was met with an uneasy silence. The three mice eyed each other. Eventually, the gazes of two centered on the largest of the three, Father Son, and there appeared to be some sort of consensus. Father Son looked back at Elizabeth and shrugged.
He, builds things.
You can hear his machines clicking and whirring just before he climbs over the side,
Brother Rainbow added. Frank shivered at the thought of it.
But if you're still in the open by then, it doesn't matter.
Elizabeth hesitated to ask, yet she felt a strange compulsion to do so.
Why not?
Once more, the three mice exchanged uneasy glances.
We don't like to talk about that,
Father Son finally answered.
He's smart, like a doctor, Frank added, but he's mean, like a biter.
A what?
Brother Rainbow pointed down the fence towards the two far quadrants.
Those would be the cannibals that chased you when you got here.
Elizabeth remembered as she saw them slinking about. One or two more began crawling tentatively up the ramp. She shuddered as she imagined one of them with Peter's level of intelligence, building machines, possibly weapons, and who knew what else.
I think I get the picture.
Speaking of which, Father Son muttered, you may want to take up your watch.
My what?
The biters are getting bold, Frank explained. The Alpha's been away from the ramp too long.
Sure enough, one of them had now poked his nose over the top.
That'd be you now, baby,
Father Son concluded.
Me?
Elizabeth protested.
I'm no fighter. Shouldn't one of you men be fighting them off?
You did a fair job on the Alpha,
Brother Rainbow retorted.
And we're like lovers, not fighters, Father Son added. You dig?
Elizabeth glowered back at him, though her usual harshness faded from the glare as she slowly accepted her position. Without another word, she scampered across the enclosure to meet the invaders. By now, the boldest of the biters had crossed over to Elizabeth's side of the fence, though the sight of her rushing his way was enough to give him pause.
If the biters are still cautious, maybe they'll be easier to drive back,
Elizabeth thought to herself.
Maybe I can scare them off without a fight.
It was something of a vain hope, true, yet Elizabeth remembered teaching her students back in the old village a number of techniques for defending themselves against smaller predators, spiders, toads, and the like. Maybe one of those strategies would work against the biters. Regardless, Elizabeth began planning a more aggressive course, just in case.
Show no fear.
Elizabeth thought to herself as she climbed the ramp.
Don't hesitate. Project confidence and strength.
As she approached the encroaching biter, Elizabeth reared back on her hind feet, rising as high as her petite frame could manage. The biter hesitated, freezing in his tracks. Elizabeth's heart beat faster, not with fear but with excitement. This was a good start.
Hey, you!
Elizabeth barked. The biter flinched but made no other motions. The mice behind him, however, each backed away. Feeling a great swell of confidence, Elizabeth shouted for all she was worth, making all the noise she could manage.
We don't want you over here! Go away! Shoo!
Elizabeth never did quite remember everything she said, only the vehemence with which she said it, and the fact that the biter then reared back on his hind legs, rising a good couple of heads higher than Elizabeth. Elizabeth's voice died in her throat as she looked up into the feral red eyes above her. All that she could manage was a faint squeak of,
"Please?"
The biter gave no response, save for a savage swipe of one hand at Elizabeth. But she had seen it coming and was ready. Heart leaping with her legs, Elizabeth darted up the biter's arm, and bracing her shoulders against the wall, her entire body heaved with a 2-footed shove against her enemy's shoulder. With a wail of shock, followed by an electric sizzle, the biter tipped over like a bowling pin and landed atop the electric fence. With a howl of pain, he then tumbled down to his own side and scurried away to tend to his burns. Thereafter, he and the other biters who rushed the fence that day would always be known by the black marks burned into their otherwise snowy hides. A second biter followed the first, this one charging low and keeping towards the wall. Elizabeth rushed over his head, driving him to the ground as she landed on his back. A third came rushing up in his wake, striking high to avoid the prone form of his compatriot. Elizabeth met him as he approached, rushing low and then rising between his legs, her entire body heaving as she tipped the biter off balance and dumped him over the side of the ramp. There was a second loud zap as the mouse crashed against the fence, leaving a grid-shaped mark seared into his back. The second biter turned around, but came from the wrong direction. He left just enough space on his right for Elizabeth to get between him and the wall. A third crackle heralded his fall. The remaining biters, having lost some of their nerve in the face of Elizabeth's assault, clustered about the base of the ramp, snarling and growling up at her, but not one of them appeared eager to lead the next charge. Elizabeth fixed the little group with her famous stare, pouring all the fire and venom she could manage into her gaze, and that was considerable. Standing at the very top of the ramp, where one side met the other, she straightened up, tall as she could manage, which was not so much, but proved reasonably imposing now that she held the high ground.
"Well?"
Elizabeth shouted.
"Who's next?"
All at once the biters' ears perked up, and the sounds of their snarls and growls were replaced instead with frantic chattering. A moment later they fled for cover.
"That's right.
Elizabeth shouted after
You
them.
better run."
So should you,
Frank's voice called after her.
The eye just turned off. Demons coming.
As Elizabeth looked back to her own side of the fence, she saw the other mice scrambling frantically for the spiral stairway in the far corner, and retreating up into the chamber suspended overhead. Elizabeth cast a final glance the biter's way, and seeing none lingering near the ramp, she rushed off to join her new community in their refuge. It was as if some switch had been flipped on in the mice's collective heads, throwing them all into a panic. The rush for cover was chaotic, reckless, and savage. The smaller individuals were trampled underfoot, some to the point of death, as the larger, quicker, stronger mice ran madly for their lives. As Elizabeth passed by the injured stragglers, she found her steps slowing and eventually stopping altogether.
"All this over a machine turning off?"
She mused. Elizabeth glanced up at the elevated shelter, and then back at the bruised, battered, prone forms around her.
"Hiding can wait,"
she decided. Elizabeth rushed to a nearby mouse that was just barely crawling forward. Throwing the fellow's arm over her shoulder, Elizabeth hauled him to his feet and helped him to the stairway. As she arrived, however, a familiar voice called down to her.
Sorry, babe. We're packed tight. No room left.
"No room?"
Elizabeth seethed. Looking to her companion, she added,
Wait here.
The other mouse didn't argue. By the dazed look in his eyes, Elizabeth wasn't convinced he could argue. In a huff, with the same air of conviction that once sent her scurrying into the gorge back home to retrieve an old friend, Elizabeth marched furiously up the steps to the box at the top.
No room?
She was going to say.
So you're just going to hide here in your safe little tower and leave the less fortunate to fend for themselves?
But as she arrived at the top, she was greeted with the putrid stench that killed her words before they left her throat. Looking in, past the sheepish faces of father, son, and his compatriots, Elizabeth saw that it was true. The mice were packed in like a bunch of white-furred sardines. No room, father, son repeated. Then Elizabeth heard it, a mirthless laugh, faint, low, and empty, as if it were no more than an afterthought. It sounded weary, even sad, straddling a thin line between chuckling and weeping, and it was steadily growing louder. Elizabeth realized with a rush that there was no point in arguing. There wasn't even time. Without another thought, she whirled about and dashed back to the bottom of the stairway, where her charge had tipped onto his back.
Come on.
Elizabeth muttered, hauling the mouse back to his feet.
You are not going to stay out in the open.
She was answered with a weary groan. Elizabeth ignored the half-hearted protest. She dragged the mouse to the furthest corner, under the shadow of the looming box, and covered him over as best she could in the strange fluff spread across the ground. Standing back to survey her handiwork, Elizabeth was utterly unsatisfied. As a hiding place, the resulting mound stood out like a sore thumb. Then the clicking began, a mechanical rattling, grinding, humming, and whirring sound, accompanied with a spring-like pop, and then a low groan of a motor straining against some heavy weight. Recalling her earlier discussion with father's son, Elizabeth realized her time was up. Demon was now scaling the outer wall. Turning around to survey what remained, Elizabeth felt her heart sink as she saw the crowd of motionless mice still lying scattered across the ground. She couldn't possibly hide all of them in the short time left to her, unless... Elizabeth didn't bother moving any of them. She simply covered as many over as completely as she could, dashing from one mouse to the next, not even checking to see if they were still alive. Elizabeth was hard at it when she heard the heavy thud of feet against the ground. Elizabeth froze. She knew there was no point in continuing. As she glanced over the lumps of fluff scattered across the ground, she saw just how futile her efforts had been. Feet, noses, and tails protruded from under conspicuous stacks all across the enclosure. Elizabeth gulped as she slowly looked up at the figure standing at the wall. In the same moment, he turned away from the wall and laid eyes on Elizabeth. Demon's features were partially hidden under a black trench coat, which he pulled close about his sides, and a black fedora, which he wore low over his brow. The entire left sleeve of the coat was missing, exposing a tiny stump of an arm, from which protruded a mechanical prosthetic built from metal plates, wires, and jagged shards that formed its talon-like fingers. Strapped to his other arm was a sleek black tube, with 3 triggers hooked around his fingers, and the prongs of a grappling hook protruding from one end. The one eye that Elizabeth could see burned bright with a keen, active intelligence. As Demon gazed back at Elizabeth, there came a loud, dry, rattling sound, not unlike a diamondback's warning. His tail rose unnaturally behind him, a patchwork of bone and muscle and wire and metal segments, ending in a sharp metal tip. Then he took a step forward. Elizabeth glanced frantically this way and that, but could see no easy escape route. She darted to her right, circling around Demon's left side, giving the towering rat as wide a berth as she could manage. Demon matched her motions, turning as he staggered forward, so that it was always his right eye staring back at Elizabeth. He walked with a painful-looking limp, his entire hip swinging with every other step, as if his left leg were nothing but dead weight. When Elizabeth saw her opening, she took it. She darted past the rat, making straight for the ramps. He made no move to stop her, instead standing utterly still and watching Elizabeth's panicked movements. As Elizabeth paused atop the ramp, Demon regarded her for a final moment. Then, to her horror, he crouched over a buried mouse. Elizabeth didn't dare make a sound as Demon brushed aside the shreds of shavings and fluff covering the subject. A moment later, Demon stood up and looked straight at Elizabeth. The corner of his mouth tugged into a wry smirk, and his hollow, droning laugh took on an edge of amusement. He tipped his fedora to Elizabeth and then turned away, proceeding to an odd structure positioned near to where the fences met, dead center of the enclosure. It was nearly twice the height of the typical mouse, but only came up to Demon's chin. Large, fin-shaped pieces of cardboard stood at even 90-degree intervals around the structure. A wooden interior frame was wrapped in wire mesh. Elizabeth had noticed it earlier, but hadn't given it a second thought. Now she found herself immensely curious as to what interest Demon could have in it. She didn't have to wonder long. Demon raised his metal hand, and in a sweeping motion brought it down, his knife-like claws slashing through the mesh as easily as through butter. In an instant the structure unraveled, the pieces of cardboard falling to the ground and the wire mesh collapsing. A torrent of small greenish-gray pellets tumbled out, scattering at Demon's feet and beyond. The rat scooped up a handful of the pellets and held them out in Elizabeth's direction. She remained rooted to the spot. Demon snorted, his smirk pulling into an amused grin, and he let the pellets fall to the ground. He turned away, giving Elizabeth no more notice, and proceeded to fill his pockets with the pellets. Upon finishing his task, he lurched back to the wall, throwing a final piercing look Elizabeth's way. Then he raised his right arm, pulled one of the triggers, and fired the grappling hook to the top of the wall. Pulling another trigger, he rewound the cord within and began the slow climb back to the world outside from whence he had come. Bit by bit, the clicking, the whirring, and the darkly mirthless laughter faded away. Yet it wasn't until the doctor's eyes started moving again that the other mice dared emerge from their hiding places. When the other mice finally did stir back to life, they did so in a mad rush of feet that could only be matched by the stampede when they had been running for cover. Every mouse in the enclosure, not just the men but the previously hidden women as well, converged on the ruined structure and began greedily devouring the scattered pellets.
Those things are your food?
Elizabeth exclaimed in disbelief.
Manna from heaven,
Father's son answered between bites.
Gifts from the doctors,
Brother Rainbow added. Chow, Frank finished. Though her stomach growled, Elizabeth felt no inclination to eat as she watched the frenzy with which the other mice jammed the pellets through their faces. She shook her head in disgust.
What unmitigated gluttony. Ugh.